Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions webinar, Moving Forward with Carbon Pricing. I am Tom Erb, a policy fellow at C2ES, and I'm pleased to be hosting this conversation with you all today. Thank you first to our panelists for taking the time to be with us. Thank you also to our audience for tuning in and contributing to the discussion. Next slide. Joining me on the webinar today are four leaders in the carbon pricing space. Marissa is a climate change specialist at the World Bank and a co-producer of the report State and Trends of Carbon Pricing 2020. Kim is the Director for Climate Policy, Carbon Markets, Aviation, and Shipping Practices at Engie Impact. Jessica is the Policy Director for the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, and Henry is the Head of Strategy for Emissions Trading for the United Kingdom Department for Business, Energy, and Industrial Strategy. Before we dive into the content, here are a few housekeeping items. We received high registration for this webinar. With that said, there's a cap to how many people can participate. If you plan to leave the webinar early, please exit to ensure someone else can take your spot. If you step away for a second, keep the webinar open to maintain your spot. If you step away and cannot get back in, simply wait a few minutes and try again, as spots will likely open up. Regardless, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the C2ES YouTube page within 24 hours. After presentations, we will have time for audience Q&A. Using your GoToWebinar question box on the right-hand side of your screen, you can submit questions throughout the webinar. Next slide, please. I'm going to kick things off with a few comments on the latest in carbon pricing and some background on C2ES. Each panelist will then give a short presentation. After all presentations are complete, I will lead with a few moderator questions and then proceed to audience Q&A. Next slide, please. So a little bit about C2ES. We are an independent and nonpartisan nonprofit organization focused on strong policy and action to address climate change. We are known as a convener of stakeholders. That means federal, state, and local governments, as well as corporations and other NGOs. And we produce publications on topics including carbon pricing, climate resilience, and international climate negotiations. I encourage you to check out our website, c2es.org, where you can find our reports, upcoming events, blogs, and more. Next slide. Related to the conversation today, we recently released updated web pages on the California Cap and Trade Program and the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI, and updated our US state carbon pricing policies map. We also updated our policy brief, Market Mechanisms, Options for Climate Policy, and lastly, our policy brief on carbon pricing proposals in the 160th Congress is available on our website and will be updated in the near future. Next slide. We have seen several recent developments in the carbon pricing space, and our panelists will dive deeper into several of them. To highlight a few examples they will not touch on, especially in the US, there are now 11 US states with carbon pricing programs, which include California and the 10 northeastern states that are part of RGGI. New Jersey rejoined RGGI in 2020 after leaving the program in 2012 and announced that it would spend a majority of program revenue on clean transportation and establish a green bank. Virginia made news in 2020 when the state enacted the Virginia Clean Economy Act and amended the Clean Energy and Community Flood Preparedness Act. As a result of this legislation, Virginia is on track to officially join RGGI starting in 2021, and it is the first southern state to do so. Despite the public health crisis, 12 northeastern states in the District of Columbia are pushing ahead on finalizing a memorandum of understanding to establish a regional cap and invest program for its GHG emissions from the transportation sector. And the final MOU is expected in the fall of 2020. Several states are also considering carbon pricing as they design new state climate action plans and develop strategies to meet ambitious emissions reductions goals. These states include New Mexico, Massachusetts, and North Carolina, among others. Also, New York's independent service operator is pushing to implement a carbon price in the state's wholesale energy markets. At the national level, 9 carbon pricing bills have been introduced in the 116th Congress. Additionally, the recently released report of the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis recommends that Congress puts a price on carbon. Internationally, as Marissa will touch on in her presentation, carbon pricing initiatives continue to grow. A couple of highlights include allowances under the European emissions trading system hitting a 14-year high this week at just over 30 euros, And since COP26 was postponed to November 2021, negotiators will have another year to come to an agreement on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which Kim will touch on briefly in her presentation. Next slide. For today's conversation, we're going to dive deeper into a few examples and recent developments. First, Marissa will provide the high-level findings from the World Bank's annual State and Trends of Carbon Pricing 2020 report. I recommend checking out the report and the World Bank's carbon pricing dashboard if you have additional questions after the webinar. After Marissa, Kim will give us an update on the latest for the carbon offsetting and reduction scheme for international aviation, also known as CORSIA, including some recent decisions related to COVID-19. Following Kim, Jessica will provide an overview of the carbon pricing approaches Pennsylvania is considering to reduce carbon pollution, especially in harder to abate sectors like industry and transportation. And to close presentations, Henry will give us some insights on the United Kingdom's new emissions trading program and how it fits into the UK's strategy to reduce or to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Next slide. So before we begin, just a reminder for those who have joined that this webinar is being recorded and will be available within 24 hours on the C2ES YouTube page. We're going to start the presentations today with Marissa. So Marissa, please proceed.
Great, thanks Tom for the introduction, and I assume you can all hear me. I'll keep talking unless I hear otherwise. And as you mentioned, I am here to talk about the state and trends of carbon pricing, which for those of you who are not familiar with our report, is the one where you see that colorful map being used all the time with way too many stripes and shades. And it's a report that comes out each year from the Carbon Markets and Innovation team in the World Bank. And there I work with the Partnership for Market Readiness, which essentially helps developing countries that are interested in carbon pricing figure out what kind of carbon pricing approach works best for them and how they can then implement that. Starting next year, this will also transition to the Partnership for Market Implementation, where, as the name implies, the focus is going to be a lot more on actually getting those carbon pricing systems up and running in a robust manner. So if you go to the next slide, please. This is a map that gives a sort of big overview picture of what we see in the carbon pricing space in terms of 2020. And as you can see from the map, it's a pretty colorful and increasingly crowded space with over 60 carbon pricing instruments in operation around the world today across almost all the continents. And there's a pretty even split between those jurisdictions that are using an emissions trading system, those that are going for a carbon tax, and actually increasingly we're seeing a lot of jurisdictions using a mix of those carbon pricing instruments. Altogether, these account for about 22% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And if you go to the next slide, please. So the theme of this year's report that we were really centering in on, which I think is also reflected more broadly in the climate change debate, is this idea of net zero decarbonization and how not only governments but also companies are trying to use carbon pricing as part of a broader policy suite in order to reach net zero emissions. And I just wanted to give 3 examples about some recent developments we've seen in the past year that touch on some of the state and trends that we've seen in carbon pricing. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So the first observation, I guess, that this report was making is that the reach of existing carbon pricing instruments is expanding in line with these net zero targets. With New Zealand, for instance, aligning the cap for its emissions trading system in line with longer term budgets and emissions targets, they're also expanding the coverage of their emissions trading system to cover agricultural emissions. And you're also seeing them lowering the amount of allowances they give away for free to industry, in line with these more ambitious targets. If you go to the next slide, please. Another trend is this idea of emergence and new carbon pricing instruments coming up. And I'm sure the other panelists will talk about a lot of other different developments in their jurisdictions. I just wanted to give the example of Indonesia, who is currently considering an emissions trading system for the power and industry sector, and is currently working on figuring out how exactly the various elements of a carbon market could be put in place to test a pilot phase of that. If you could go to the next slide, please. The final point I wanted to highlight, which is one I had mentioned a bit earlier with the map, is this idea of having more than one carbon pricing instrument in place. So we're starting to see a mix of emissions trading systems, or an emissions trading system and a carbon tax, particularly in the Latin American and Caribbean region. And the most prominent example of this is probably Mexico, which launched its pilot carbon market at the start of this year, which is actually operating alongside its carbon tax. In the pilot phase, the national carbon market covers almost 2/5 of Mexico's national emissions, and will transition to a fully operational market in 2023. In the meantime, they're currently figuring out how they will auction their allowances, and are also developing an offset crediting framework as well. If you could go to the next slide, please. One new aspect in the State and Trends of Carbon Pricing report that we hadn't really covered in previous years is a focus on crediting mechanisms. And before I finish up the presentation today, I just wanted to give two quick overview findings from the crediting chapter. And if you could go to the next slide, please. So if we have a look at the crediting market, you can see that it's still really dominated by those crediting mechanisms that were set up under the Kyoto Protocol, so the Clean Development Mechanism and Joint Implementation. As you can kind of see on those two big blue chunks over there, it really does account still for a large share of credits issued. But what we're seeing in the past couple of years, as you can tell kind of by these increasing layers, is that more and more jurisdictions are starting to develop their own domestic crediting mechanism to complement their carbon taxes and emissions trading systems, which not only allow those regulated companies some flexibility and compliance, but also means that a lot of the co-benefits that you get from crediting is captured in those jurisdictions. Next slide, please. And then this is just because I have a real weak spot for Sankey graphs, but we broke down the credits in terms of sector. And again, sort of similar to the previous graph, what you can kind of see is that the top three categories, so industrial gases, renewable energy, and fugitive emissions, are coming from those Kyoto Protocol crediting mechanisms. And so it's still really dominating the way in which we see the crediting market. But interestingly, forestry in the past 5 or 10 years is a sector that has really become a lot more popular in terms of crediting mechanisms, both not only from a government perspective, but also in terms of the interest that we're seeing from the private sector in their voluntary crediting purchases as well. Next slide, please. So that really brings me to the end of my presentation. I do hope that if you have any more questions or are interested in carbon pricing, you check out the report. It really does try and capture all of these different ways of slicing and dicing the carbon pricing world. I've only really presented in terms of the numbers of coverage, but you could also look at it, for instance, in terms of the amount of revenue that was raised and how it was used. So yeah, I really encourage you all to check it out and the carbon pricing dashboard in case you ask me questions that I may not be able to answer on this webinar today. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you so much, Marissa. Very helpful overview, and congratulations again on the report. I too recommend it. There's such a plethora of helpful information in there. I especially found the information about New Zealand's efforts to price agriculture emissions quite interesting. And then, of course, the additional information about crediting is helpful. And I think, lastly, I have to say that you're probably making a lot of people jealous, including me, with the slides and the slide design. It's very cool. So thank you, Marissa. And now we'll proceed to Kim's presentation. So Kim, please take it away.
Thank you so much. As Tom mentioned, I've just joined the amazing team at Engie Impact from the State Department, where I most recently served as chief negotiator on climate change for the United States. And under the Obama administration, I managed the teams that negotiated the Paris Agreement as well as CORSIA. So I'm happy to be here today to help explain where we are with CORSIA and how the Paris Agreement relates. From my perch at Engie Impact, intractable sustainability challenges, and one of my areas of focus continues to be aviation. Next slide, please. I have included here just a quick overview of all of the relevant CORSIA decisions. For reference, I just want to focus on how much work, technical and diplomatic, went into getting CORSIA to implementation. And frankly, the work really started back in 2011 when John Podesta asked my former boss, President Obama's Special Envoy for Climate Change, Todd Stern, to step in as lead negotiator to resolve a kind of nascent trade war sparked by the application of the EU emissions trading system to foreign carriers. We've come a long way since then. And of course, we've passed another major threshold when the Trump administration, with full support of US airlines, reaffirmed its intention to implement CORSIA back in 2018 and again in 2019. Next slide, please. First of all, I'll just note that I'm not giving an overview of how CORSIA works. That's been covered many times elsewhere. What I'm looking at specifically here is where we are now with implementation. And I think the good news is that we're finally at the point where we have a strong sense of eligible programs, as well as vintage and timeframe restrictions. And we're getting to work trying to solve the difficulties around preventing double counting. Next slide. One thing that the kind of advent of CORSIA has shown and the approval of CORSIA eligible programs symbolizes is that we're beginning a new era in the global carbon market. In many cases, the border between compliance and voluntary market mechanisms no longer exists. And the fact that CORSIA has now approved several different quote unquote voluntary market mechanisms for use in a compliance system kind of bears this out quite clearly. Earlier this year, the ICAO Council did take this decision to approve 6 programs as eligible for use under CORSIA. They've also conditionally approved 3 additional programs, and this gives some sense to airlines of where they can begin to think about investing for their future offsetting needs under CORSIA. 2 major things to note. First, all of the approved programs come with some notable exclusions. So you can't just go into the market and buy anything registered by the American Carbon Registry, for example. Each of these programs will put in place CORSIA eligible tags to note which units are CORSIA eligible, but that won't help you when you're talking to project developers, pre-registration. Project proponents and developers will need to have a clear sense of what these exclusions are as they kind of jump into the market for origination. And second, and this is quite relevant as many airlines have invested heavily in projects to reduce emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. And many large corporates have also kind of dived into the REDD+ area as they've started to focus more on nature-based solutions. But CORSIA is requiring that REDD+ projects be nested within a jurisdictional baseline. So many projects do not meet that requirement today, and it's definitely something that airlines are going to need to focus on going forward. Next slide, please. The second and third issues that I wanted to focus on relate directly to the Paris Agreement. So I'll stop briefly to discuss where Paris Agreement parties have made ICAO's job much more challenging. As many of you know, parties hit a political logjam in adopting guidance on Article 6 cooperative approaches. That logjam was hit first in 2018, and then unfortunately we were not able to get beyond it at COP25 in 2019 either. So it may or may not be resolved at COP26, which has now been delayed until 2021. The absence of Article 6 rules are pretty important. We do not currently have a collective, transparent way for countries to indicate when they authorize emissions units or offsets for use towards another target, for example, another country's NDC or towards CORSIA compliance requirements, or when they account for those units against their own NDC. So that would be the way that we would prevent and ensure that we were preventing double counting. We also don't have an agreed approach for solving tricky accounting issues that stem from the diversity in type and time scale of NDCs, which makes it very hard to know exactly how to account in order to avoid double counting. And finally, we don't yet have agreement on the eligibility of emission reductions generated pre-2020, particularly relevant for the parent glut of pre-2020 CERs from the CDM. This is an area where, sorry, next slide. These areas are all places where ICAO needed answers in order for CORSIA to function. And so the failure to agree at COP25 basically left the ICAO Council no choice. So earlier this year, the ICAO Council took an important decision on unit eligibility dates and determined which units would be deemed eligible for CORSIA use during the first compliance cycle, which is the so-called pilot phase from 2021 to 2023. The ICAO Council has said that units issued from activities that started their first crediting period from 1 January 2016 would be eligible for emission reductions that occurred through 31 December 2020. It's important that after the pilot phase, the Council will be able to take into account any decisions taken by the Paris Agreement and adjust its guidance if it so chooses. But it's important to note that unit eligibility was one of 3 key sticking points at COP25. So this decision actually sets existing precedent for eligible units in the pre-2020 or from the pre-2020 period for use in the post-2020 period. This is important because if I, for example, was advising companies on offset purchases, and I am, I will strongly recommend against any purchases or continuation of ongoing investments in projects that started their first crediting period before January of 2016. Next slide. The third issue of focus for this presentation is double counting. Again, a little bit of background. To prevent double counting between the Paris Agreement and CORSIA, we would ideally have guidance and rules under both. And it's clear that both were planning to have such guidance and rules so that the two systems could talk to each other and ensure that there was no double counting between them. The draft Article 6 guidance clearly indicates the intention to provide guidance and also a method of reporting for non-NDC uses that were authorized by host country governments. But since Paris Agreement parties haven't yet adopted their half of the guidance, ICAO has again been forced to go it alone on the issue of double counting. Next slide. And despite a lot of criticism, the ICAO Council has actually taken this job very, very seriously. It's put in place detailed rules to try and ensure that CORSIA eligible units are not also used to meet a party's NDC under the Paris Agreement. You can see on the screen that there are a lot of different elements of this guidance, but the most important piece is that the program that has been deemed eligible is required to obtain written attestation from the host country's national focal point, specifying and describing the steps taken to prevent mitigation associated with CORSIA units from also being claimed toward the host country's national mitigation targets. These attestations must be publicly available and they must be detailed. The program is then also required to monitor national reporting on accounting to ensure that the host country accounted as described in its attestation. And if the host country does not account as described in its attestation, the program is to have procedures in place in order to compensate for double claimed mitigation. Now, this is all, again, quite advanced, quite detailed, but the question really is how are programs going to put these types of requirements in place, and how are they and the project proponents supposed to be engaging, on such high level important issues with host country governments. This obviously brings notable new political risk for project development at this time. And it would be much more helpful if programs knew how host countries were planning to account. If so, they would be able to translate it into a standard for projects. It would also be useful if host countries used a common platform to convey accounting information. Then programs would much more easily be able to track accounting and monitor the need to compensate. So in other words, we'd really love to see Article 6 rules. And I just want to note that a lot of the problems that CORSIA is facing will also be impactful for broader kind of voluntary market offset use as well. Next slide, please. Just want to briefly touch on two other points, which are important, but perhaps don't require as much discussion in this conversation. The first is that the ICAO Council recently agreed to adjust the baseline that's used to determine offsetting requirements under CORSIA from an average of 2019 and 2020 to just a 2019 baseline in order to avoid significantly increasing airlines' future offsetting costs under CORSIA. The United States, the EU, Latin America, and several others pushed for this change quite quickly after COVID hit. They were concerned about a number of things. One would be moving the goalpost from the intent of the program originally. I think that initial estimates said that offsetting requirements would increase somewhere around 40% for airlines if the 2019-2020 average baseline was to be used. They were also concerned about additional costs, putting additional costs on the aviation sector while it was in a pretty dire straits. And the third point, which is probably the most important, is that they were very concerned about the potential to lose support for CORSIA implementation due to COVID impacts. So moving quickly to adjust this baseline was basically seen as the way to save CORSIA and ensure that it would be able to continue to function going forward. It's notable that after the pilot phase, ICAO Council will consider making the baseline change permanent, and will make a recommendation to the ICAO Assembly as to whether or not that's required. The last big thing I wanted to touch on is just something that's kind of true to my own heart and something I'm working on very intensely here at Engie Impact now. And it's simply the fact that the aviation sector is not on track to meet its targets without CORSIA after 2035. Emissions are continuing to rise now, notwithstanding COVID, and are expected to continue to rise post 2035. And despite a lot of biofuel offtake agreements, it's kind of a shocking number, but the global uptake of sustainable aviation fuel still sits below 0.1%. So obviously much more is needed from both the public and the private sector to drive SAF demand and to develop and deploy truly scalable technology for sustainable aviation fuel. And that's something where kind of continued engagement with the market is likely to be necessary. And I kind of look forward to seeing how all of you who are engaged in CORSIA might get engaged also in the SAF market going forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kim. Very helpful, and thank you for hustling through several really important and timely topics there. A lot to follow up on. I really appreciated touching on just a few things here, the explanation of the connection and now blending of voluntary and compliance markets. I thought that was an interesting point. Of course, touching on where the Paris Agreement stands and the importance of Article 6 rules and the consequences of not having those rules. And then, of course, touching on where CORSIA stands and diving a little deeper into double counting. So thank you so much, and I hope we can go back on some of those topics and dive a little deeper in the Q&A. So now let's go to the subnational level in the US. And Jessica, why don't you proceed?
Sure, thank you. I appreciate you inviting me to talk about the good work that Pennsylvania has going on right now. And you can go to the next slide. So I just wanted to give everyone a quick overview of Pennsylvania's energy sector. We have a lot of energy in Pennsylvania. We're the top electricity exporter in the country, and we are second overall in energy generation to Texas, largely due to the robust natural gas production that we have from the Marcellus and Utica formations. Next slide. In Pennsylvania, we know we are already experiencing the impacts of climate change. We have seen the temperatures increase since 1900, and we are anticipated to see higher temperatures through 2050 and beyond. Additionally, we are a very wet state, being part of the Northeast, and unfortunately 2018 was the wettest year on record within the Commonwealth. And that increased rainfall resulted in extreme weather events and flooding throughout the state that ended up costing residents about $144 million in damages, and then additional costs to the Commonwealth from state-maintained infrastructure to the tune of about $125 million. Next slide. So I just mentioned the impacts to our infrastructure, but we know that the costs of climate change are expensive, and not just to state governments, but to our citizens through the additional health impacts and our industries like agriculture. Pennsylvania is a huge agriculture state. It's one of our top industries. And in 2018, when we had all of that flooding, our farmers lost a lot of crops. And we know that the situation is only going to get worse as we see droughts and heat stress for our dairy industry. Additionally, we have a lot of Lyme disease in Pennsylvania. We are the #1 state for Lyme disease, which is certainly not a ranking that we're proud of. Next slide. So according to the 2019 Yale Climate National Survey, 67% of Pennsylvanians believe that global warming is happening. And 67% also believe that global warming will harm future generations. And 72% of Pennsylvanians support regulating CO2 as a pollutant. So because of this, all of the impacts that we're seeing because of climate change, Governor Wolf established the first greenhouse gas emission reduction goals for the state of Pennsylvania. And it is, those goals are consistent with the Paris Accord and the US Climate Alliance goals. So next slide. So on this slide, you can see where we were in 2005 and the progress that we've made since then through 2015. And you can also see how far we need to go in order to reach those greenhouse gas reduction goals. So while compiling our climate action plan, we worked with our contractor and projected where our emissions are supposed to go. And we saw in that energy assessment report that greenhouse gas emissions are actually projected to increase in Pennsylvania, which makes the work that we're doing that much more important. Because to reach that 2050 goal, we have a pretty long way to go. Next slide. And here's a quick overview of the types of greenhouse gas emissions by sector that we see. So this is all greenhouse gas emissions, not just CO2, but it is shown in a CO2 equivalent. So some sectors, they produce almost exclusively carbon emissions, such as the electricity sector, while other sectors produce other greenhouse gases, such as methane from the industrial sector. And you can see in 2017 that industrials, that lime green bar, is our largest sector of greenhouse gas emissions. And electricity production, the teal bar towards the top, is our second largest. And then the purple bar represents transportation. So transportation is actually the largest greenhouse gas sector in the country and in the region, but in Pennsylvania, it's #3. And it's not because that we have less transportation emissions, it's just that our share of electricity and industrial emissions are that much higher. Next slide. So when we were evaluating, what steps Pennsylvania was going to take with regard to reducing emissions because of the complete failure at the federal level to adequately address them. Cap and trade was the program that kind of came to the top of the pile. And there are a number of reasons. It's effective, it's known, We have used cap and trade, in multiple instances, particularly with regard to air pollutants, the SO2 or the acid rain and the SO2 programs. So we've had some successful implementation of a cap and trade program in the electricity generation sector in RGGI, and overall cap and trade or carbon pricing is viewed as fair. We have heard over and over from companies that addressing carbon is something that they take seriously. I think they see it as part of their corporate social responsibility. And many would prefer a national approach with a carbon price, but in the absence of that federal leadership, they support the regional collaboration versus a state-by-state approach. Additionally, I have heard recently that they would like other sectors to be looked at for greenhouse gas reductions through cap and trade or a carbon price. Next slide. But there are also significant negatives of a carbon price or a cap and trade. Environmental justice is a pretty big one because it's not a strict emissions limit within a region, and if you're putting a cap on an entire sector, you may see some emissions increase at specific plants, and that is one of the main concerns of our environmental justice community. Additionally, there are low-income impacts. It can be seen as regressive because it does have the potential to increase prices of goods and services. And if we tend to see an inability for low-income folks to gain access to the investment program. So I like to say this is the you have to have something to get something mentality that we have in a lot of our programs. So we are really thinking about how we can increase access to the investments for our low-income residents. There's also, job impacts on the high pollution industries, mainly, right now coal-fired power plants and other, historical or legacy industries. Next slide. So I'm not going to really get into what RGGI is too much, but I mean, you can see here it's pretty much the entire Northeast. Virginia is anticipated to join next year, and hopefully we will be soon behind. Next slide. In October 2019, it feels like yesterday and forever ago at the same time, but Governor Wolf directed my agency to begin a rulemaking process that will allow us to join RGGI. So we plan to present that in September to our Environmental Quality Board, and we are in the process now of doing some extra engagement. But one of the things that we've been trying to express to our citizens and residents is that we're already paying a price on carbon, and it's through the impacts of pollution and climate change that we're already experiencing. Next slide. So this is just a quick timeline for you. I guess the takeaway on this one is that we hope to have the rulemaking finalized next year, and Pennsylvania has an extremely long rulemaking process that involves a lot of public comment. But we hope to be able to take part in the first auction of 2022. Next slide. So, as I mentioned, RGGI is only applicable to power plants, specifically the fossil fuel-fired power plants or the electricity generating units, and those only that have 25 megawatts or more of nameplate capacity. And there are additional qualifiers. So, they have to have 25 megawatts of nameplate capacity, and they have to send more than 10% of their gross generation to any entity. So in layman's terms, if a power plant is generating electricity and sending more than 10% of that electricity to the grid, they would be a covered source under the regulation. And this is the case for power plants that are designed to generate and distribute the electricity. So there are other fossil fuel fired electric generating units that may meet that threshold, the 25 megawatts. However, they wouldn't be considered a covered source if they're not sending more than 10% of their gross generation to the grid. So for instance, some universities, hospitals, and others with on-site generation may not trigger that requirement, even though they may meet that 25 megawatt threshold. So that would mean that the majority of generation produced is used on site, and therefore it would be exempted from the rule. We're also proposing a further exemption criteria to the regulation that would make a limited exemption for combined heat and power systems. And so these systems produce heat as a byproduct, which is then harnessed for heating, cooling, other operations. And we are including similar language that Virginia has included in their rulemaking. So it's not part of the model rule, but there is a case for it. So given Pennsylvania's abundance of natural gas and the efficiency of cogeneration, we want to make sure that we're not disincentivizing future combined heat and power. Next slide. This is just a quick overview of the investments. So, half of a cap and trade program or cap and invest program is the cap. That's the rulemaking. And then the other half is the investments. And here you can see where, most of the states that are in RGGI are spending their money. There's a lot that goes into energy efficiency, which we know is a pretty big job creator. So next slide. Unfortunately, Pennsylvania doesn't have some of the same authorities that the other RGGI states have. We are using the authority that's given to us under the Air Pollution Control Act, which means that spending from the fund can only be used for activities that reduce air pollution and improve air quality. So it does include all of those spending categories that are included in the model rule, such as energy efficiency, greenhouse gas abatement, and renewable energy. However, we would not be able to make those direct payments to low-income consumers, for instance, that Maryland does. Next slide, please. So the blue line here is what Pennsylvania's electricity generating emissions would look like if we did nothing. And the red line is just the RGGI cap, and then the green line includes the investments. So you can see by this slide that RGGI significantly decreases our CO2, NOx, and SO2 emissions significantly throughout 2030. Next slide. So, what does that mean? Well, that means that there are huge health benefits in Pennsylvania from this rulemaking, mostly from the reduction in PM 2.5. So we've used EPA's methodology and determined that it would save between $232 million and $525 million annually from consumers who would miss work due to asthma attacks or other respiratory illnesses. It would, those cumulative numbers are huge, and from avoided lost work and avoided ER visits. Children would miss less school due to ozone action days and asthma related illnesses that they might experience. Next slide. And there are also huge economic benefits. The economic modeling that we've done shows that participating in RGGI will lead to a net increase of more than 27,000 jobs and add $1.9 billion to the gross state product in Pennsylvania. So that's not even factoring in those health benefits. That's just the economic benefits. And And the full analysis that we've conducted, we're going to present that to our Environmental Quality Board in September, but we're also planning a webinar, a public webinar at the end of this month to be able to explain all of the benefits of RGGI. You know, we are, I don't know if I've said this yet, I'm sorry if I didn't, but we're projected to receive more than $300 million a year in proceeds from RGGI. So that's pretty significant. That's every year. And the Wolf administration intends to use the revenues to fund job creation and retention programs, including new workforce development opportunities, energy efficiency improvements for small businesses and large businesses and homeowners, and provide economic support for communities that might be affected by the changing of electricity, where coal-fired power plants are going to close down, and shift over to the clean energy sources. Next slide. So the significance of this slide is looking at the 2030 timeline. Firm power prices in Pennsylvania are largely driven by natural gas prices, and you can see the decline in the gas prices from 2020 to 2022, and then gas prices are modeled to rise, and it directly affects the power prices. So in 2028, we project that our electricity demand will be lower due to the investments in energy efficiency, distributed solar, and biogas. So that would end up putting some downward pressure on those prices. So you can see that gray line in 2030 actually ends up being lower than business as usual. So RGGI is definitely good for long-term power prices. Next slide. And as I mentioned in my first slide, Pennsylvania is the top electricity exporter in the country, and we would like to maintain that status. It is a huge job industry for us. And you can see again at 2030 that smart investments actually can lead to higher exports overall in 2030 and through 2025 through 2030. Next slide, I'm going to switch gears here a little bit. Sorry, there's not really a good transition. But with electric power emissions shrinking in part due to the success of RGGI, we think it's also time that we focus on the largest source in the country and in the region, and that is transportation. So the red line on this slide, this is region-wide. This is not just specific to Pennsylvania. The red line is transportation, and you can see that it's going up. So the blue line right under it is electric power, and that is going down, which is good. We want to maintain that downward trajectory, but we need to do something about that red line that is increasing. So we have been working with our fellow state agencies in the Northeast. If you want to go to the next slide. There we go. It makes sense, I think, why we would target the electric power first in a cap and invest program. The sources are already regulated entities. There's a finite number. We know where they are. They're stationary. You know, you can't really pick up a coal-fired power plant and move it. But transportation is certainly a tougher nut for us to crack because it's pretty much everyone. It's you, it's me. It's our personal choices and decisions, but we think it can be done. So this is just another slide of the breakdown, you know, region-wide. 43% of the CO2 emissions in the region are from transportation. Next slide. So here is the scale of our opportunity that we have. Sorry, it's a little blurry. You know, it's huge. There are a lot of people that live in this region. There are a lot of vehicles, and there is a lot of money that we could put into some really smart investments for transportation. Next slide. So based on our modeling, you know, there's a lot of commercial, you know, transit buses and opportunities for schools and trucks. And then there's also a lot of opportunities for the active transportation with regard to bike lanes and sidewalks. Next slide. So the TCI states did some economic modeling, and it really shows negligible impacts from TCI. You know, I mean, they're tiny, but they're positive. So when it comes to, you know, impacts on the economy from cap and invest, there's not huge impacts here, but they're at least positive. And there's a huge opportunity for reduction. So we're talking about a 20% reduction or a 25% reduction in carbon dioxide through the program period with very, very little economic impact. Next slide. This is pretty much my last one. I also wanted to mention that Pennsylvania is currently considering a greenhouse gas petition that was submitted to us by the Clean Air Council and hundreds of other petitioners. And they believe that emission reductions are necessary to assure the constitutional environment trust established by our Constitution, our state Constitution, Article 1, Section 27. So they submitted this petition to us, which we presented to the Environmental Quality Board, and we're now modeling it with our contractor, but it would create a declining cap of 3% annually, and it's economy-wide. So this is really, it's interesting to me because this is one of the things that we've heard several industry representatives say, you know, like we want to do something, but we can't really do it alone. We need everybody to kind of do it. So the petition would, the goal would be to achieve carbon neutrality by 2052 in Pennsylvania. So the sectors that we're modeling, we tried to capture most things, and we're modeling electricity generation, transportation, manufacturing, and energy production and delivery, and how a statewide cap and invest program would impact those industries. So, and that is it. Next slide.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for that helpful presentation. I really appreciated how you kind of started the presentation by focusing on what we're really trying to solve here, and then looking at the potential climate impacts in Pennsylvania, and then diving into the emissions portfolio, of course, detailing where carbon pricing stands in Pennsylvania, and really highlighting the potential benefits of both RGGI and TCI. I especially appreciated the public health and economic benefits, so thank you for doing that. And then, of course, your last point about the petition to create an economy-wide declining cap is quite fascinating and also new to me, so thank you for sharing, and I'm sure there'll be additional questions about that, so thank you so much. We're now going to proceed to Henry, but before we do, just a reminder that this webinar is being recorded in case you have to go in and out, and it'll be available on the C2ES YouTube page in about 24 hours. And then after Henry's presentation, we're going to proceed directly to audience Q&A. So a reminder that you can submit your questions directly using the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. And after Henry, we'll proceed directly to those questions. Additionally, it looks like we're going to have about 15 additional minutes, so we'll go to about 2:45 Eastern time to make sure we can answer as many questions as possible. So thank you so much. And Henry, please proceed with your presentation.
Henry Dieudonné-Demaria, speaking to you from a dusk-strewn London. An honour and a pleasure to be speaking to everyone this evening, and I'll wrap things up by talking quite briefly about the UK government's plans and hopes for carbon pricing, and in particular our proposed new United Kingdom emissions trading system. And I'll start off with two things. One is an apology, because whilst I will talk as openly and freely as I possibly can this evening, as you're all no doubt aware, the UK is currently in quite detailed negotiations with the European Union. So inevitably, I'm restricted in what I'm able to say, and I'm going to disappoint some people. So my apologies for that. And do invite me back in 6 months' time for what I think will be a much freer and more detailed conversation. But I also wanted, if it makes the people of Pennsylvania feel any better, Lyme disease is kicking off in urban London, something rotten right now. A walk in the local park has become quite an operation in delousing. It's quite something. But I'd like to talk briefly about how we are looking to take forward carbon pricing as we leave the European Union. Could we move on to the first slide, please? It's worth saying, by way of a bit of context, that the UK is modestly proud of its background in carbon pricing and cap and trade in particular. We started out with our own first of a kind UK emissions trading system back in the mid-noughties, and the UK was one of the key early developers of the EU emissions trading system. And over recent years, the EU emissions trading system, I think we feel has become a real object lesson in how to develop a robust cap and trade system at a continental scale, and it's been a real learning curve there. The UK has been a core participant in developing and bringing on the EU ETS, and now as the UK leaves the European Union, we're looking to take that ambition forwards. And next slide, please. The UK government has committed to maintaining at least the same level of ambition in carbon pricing as it has as a participant in the EU ETS. And as a core component of that, we have proposed to set up an independent United Kingdom emissions trading system, and to have that in place at the end of the transition period that the UK has in leaving the European Union. So we're looking to have an independent cap and trade system in place for the beginning of next year. The aim is twofold here. One is to maintain a clear and consistent carbon price for UK industry, also to manage a smooth transition for all of those sectors who have been subject to the EU ETS and will be subject to a UK domestic approach. And next slide, please. Core to the approach we're looking to take is the question of linking this domestic market in with the EU ETS. The UK has said in its negotiating position that it's opening to considering linking in the future UK ETS with the EU ETS. And the aim there is to be able to link the benefits of the two markets to gain a much wider, freer market for carbon abatement and the benefits that accrue to that. At the same time, and as I've mentioned, because this is all subject to negotiation, the UK is also developing the potential for this UK emissions trading system to operate as a standalone, isolated domestic market. And we're also shortly to be consulting on an entirely different approach to carbon pricing, that of levying a carbon emissions tax, as a means of ensuring that we've got a mechanism to maintain a consistent carbon price, whatever the outcome of negotiations. Oh, would you move on to the next slide, please? Some of the innovative features that we're taking forward in the UK ETS are around, firstly, ambition. We'll be starting with a 5% reduction in the emissions cap relative to the UK's equivalent share under phase 4 of the EU ETS. And we're also looking to have a more nuanced and focused approach to price control, with an auction reserve price to ensure a consistent, stable price floor, particularly in the early days and months of a domestic market, and also a more responsive approach to cost containment to maintain consistency of price. The government has said that it will maintain a continuity of approach to free allowances to manage risks around carbon leakage and competitiveness for UK industries. We also want to look at the overall emissions cap and the scope of the UK ETS. If you could move on to the next slide, please, we'll talk about those. To begin with, we've said that we will cover under a UK ETS the same sectors that are currently covered by the EU ETS, but with the possibility, and we'll talk about this further, of expanding the scope to cover a broader section of the economy in time. But so to begin with, around a third of UK emissions will be covered by the UK ETS. And the way that we're planning to use the UK ETS to manage down those emissions in the context of the UK government's commitment to delivering a net zero economy in 2050 is through a descending cap trajectory. And if you could move on to the next slide, please. As we said, we've put in place, we said we will put in place an interim 5% reduction on the status quo. But later this year, we're expecting detailed technical advice from our independent committee on climate change, which will set out how we can develop a long-term declining trajectory towards net zero in 2050, which will then enshrine in law as a net zero cap. The aim is that we'll give business and policymakers a very clear and transparent long-term policy signal of the emissions envelope within the UK. If you could move on to what I think is the penultimate slide. Whilst we've talked about publicly making sure that whatever approach we take to carbon pricing as we leave the EU, we will ensure a smooth and consistent trajectory and transition for UK industry, we've also said that in the medium to long term, the UK government sees this as a real opportunity to innovate and to drive increased ambition in a national cap and trade system. So beyond, as I say, aligning our cap and its trajectory with the net zero target, we're interested in how we could evolve and increase the scope of the UK ETS going forward. And we're interested in exploring doing this in a number of ways. Be that expanding scope to different sectors, and we've heard in previous presentations here, the potential to move beyond the current sectors that tend to be covered in cap and trade. In the case of the EU and UK ETSs, we're talking about heavy industry, energy generation and aviation. We'd be interested in looking at broader transport, construction, agriculture that are being brought into other cap and trade systems. So we'd like to understand the potential benefits, risks and challenges of doing so. Equally, trying to understand better how we can have an ambitious domestic cap and trade system, particularly an ambitious domestic cap, whilst managing challenges around competitiveness and leakage. And we see potential innovations around carbon border adjustments being proposed by the EU, and a range of other potential mechanisms being proposed or brought forward in other jurisdictions. So we're interested in exploring into what the right answers are to manage these transborder tensions in carbon pricing ambition. In the future, we're certainly keen to explore linking to other jurisdictions across a range of potential factors. As I say, at this point, the UK is in negotiation with the EU about the potential to link these two cap and trade systems together, but we'd hopefully see that as a first step towards the potential for wider linking. And we're also interested to look at whether there are options to bring negative emissions and offsets into cap and trade, into the traded sector. Currently, one of the challenges in the UK is driving increased delivery and development of negative emissions, given that these currently sit in a primarily voluntary rather than a regulatory market, and as such they command a pretty low market price. In the UK, you can buy pretty high quality forestry carbon offsets at about £4 or £5 per tonne. Going forward, we don't feel that that's a sufficient price to drive the sorts of uptake that we need to deliver long-term net zero in the UK. So we're interested to explore what options there are to bring negative emissions into the regulated sector in the longer term. And if we could move to the final slide, please. Without dwelling too much on this, aviation is one of the areas where we're looking closely at what the most effective fit between the international approach via CORSIA and a domestic cap and trade system would be. So there we are looking at what an effective interaction and an effective policy ecosystem would be. I'll wrap up there. I appreciate that's been a very high level tour. I'm very keen to get into a more detailed discussion and to start to get some comparators and comparisons with some other jurisdictions. But I'll leave it there. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Henry. That was a very helpful and detailed overview that I think will have folks walking away with a good understanding of the UK's approach. So thank you and congratulations on these efforts. So we have about 20 minutes now for audience questions. I'm going to skip over the moderator question. I'll kick it off with one to open it up. But again, there are some questions coming in, but please submit those using the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. But just to kick things off, and this is a question for anyone who would like to chime in, hopefully quickly, even though it's a hard question to answer quickly. But in the US, I'd say there's an active conversation about the role of carbon pricing in a climate policy package. Some are even saying that we should abandon pricing due to the political challenges of moving forward with these types of schemes. My question is, why do you believe carbon pricing is essential to decarbonize in either the jurisdictions that you're operating in or the sectors that you're working in? And why do we need pricing to be successful, or do we not? And I think if you could relate it to your jurisdiction and your efforts and your challenges, that would be great. So for example, Henry, why is carbon pricing essential to the net zero goal that the UK has? Or Kim talking about how pricing could be essential to advance sustainable aviation fuels, which I know you wanted to talk a little bit more about. Or Jessica talking about pricing in energy intensive states. So I'll leave it there. Feel free to jump in if you're interested in taking a first stab at that question.
I'm happy to go first on this, and simply to say that well, someone put it like this to me the other day. It would be really nice if there was a market for carbon because we've got loads of it. It feels like the most fundamental market failure when it comes to climate change is that we don't price the costs, be they social, economic, or environmental, of greenhouse gas emissions into the economy. And carbon pricing is a fundamental way of putting that price back in a systematic and a strategic way. Now in the UK, I don't think we feel yet that carbon pricing is enough in and of itself to address climate change and to get us to net zero. And why do I say that? Well, whilst I think we hope in the long term, as we get mature markets for decarbonisation technologies, that robust carbon pricing will do the heavy lifting needed. At the moment, we're also looking to put a lot of government investment into infant industry and new technologies, particularly in areas like carbon capture and storage, and some of the more innovative technologies such as biomass or direct air carbon capture and storage, where it wouldn't be possible to have a carbon price sufficient to drive those at scale and have a realistically functioning economy. So at the moment, we have a long-term approach for carbon pricing where we expect over time a tightening emissions cap should drive a predictably increasing carbon price, and so drive long-term investment planning for industry so that they can plan long-term to make potentially high-cost investments in decarbonisation technology that otherwise would be hard to argue for. But at the same time, we are filling the gap in terms of investment and in innovation support to make sure that those technologies are available when needed, particularly as we move into the early 2030s, where we see it's going to be a key time for large-scale rollout of, for example, carbon capture and storage.
Okay, thank you very much, Henry. Does anyone else want to jump in?
Tom, I can say a couple of words from the sort of developing country perspective through our work with the PMR.
Sure, go ahead. Thank you.
So I think it's definitely a good question to ask ourselves as we really only focus on this one type of policy instrument in terms of climate change. But I don't think anyone on this call would come out and say that just by putting a carbon price in place, you're going to have the whole climate change puzzle completely solved. Although it's, Henry was saying it does play a very useful role. I think what we're starting to look at now through the work with the Partnership for Market Readiness is to kind of build a stronger case as to why carbon pricing can make sense in very different roles and very different jurisdictions. So I think for a long time, we all thought that a carbon price should be the leading, predominant, broad-based policy instrument. But we're finding that that may not always be the right solution in specific jurisdictions. And actually, I really enjoyed Jessica's presentation because I think she highlights some of the additional, I guess what we can call co-benefits of carbon pricing that a lot of us maybe didn't initially consider, that in addition to emissions reductions, it's actually a really useful tool in terms of doing things like raising revenue, which particularly right now is a very attractive part of policy making. And it can also lead to a number of co-benefits that for the developing countries we work with are quite attractive in terms of things like helping to reduce air pollution. So if we can also think of a more holistic way in which we talk about carbon pricing and how it fits in a broader climate change strategy and not just focus on the instrument itself, I think that's at least been very helpful for our work.
This is Jessica. I would absolutely agree with that. In Pennsylvania, we're doing many things with regard to climate change, and the cap and invest programs are just one of them. So, with like cap and invest on electricity generation, we have other programs in Pennsylvania that prioritize energy efficiency and alternative energy, our RPS. I think a carbon price is one component of an overall strategy. I think, same thing with transportation. We are a Section 177 state, which means that we have adopted California's greenhouse gas emission limits on vehicles. But we're also looking at becoming a ZEV state for passenger vehicles and potentially even the medium and heavy duty vehicles. So I think it's a piece of it, but I don't think it's the entire answer, we'll say.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And Kim, I don't know if you wanted to add anything there, but feel free to jump in.
Sure, I'm happy to. I mean, I agree with what everyone else has said. In a perfect world, a carbon price, set through a truly global market with a cap based on the needs of science, that would really be the solution to climate change. But we don't have that, and I don't think we will in my lifetime. So we need to sew together the various solutions that we have, including kind of these piecemeal attempts at carbon pricing with other efforts to spur the technological advances, as Henry mentioned, that will kind of get us to a real solution to climate. Aviation is, if not a unique situation, it's definitely an example of a hard to decarbonize sector where we can put together gap filler type mechanisms like CORSIA, which was intended to begin addressing aviation emissions at lower cost than would be possible through in-sector reductions. But we will need to, as I alluded at the end of my presentation, combine that with other market efforts to get to real in-sector solutions over time. So the creation of low carbon fuel standard for aviation jet fuel would be a next step that would kind of work at getting the technology we need to market to reduce in-sector for aviation.
Okay, thank you so much, Cam. Very helpful. Moving to another question and related, but there were several questions related to the importance of linking or expanding these programs beyond specific sectors. So I think a general question that anyone can jump in on would be, can the panelists speak to the importance of cross-border and cross-sector carbon pricing efforts? And is there a preference to move towards linking of ETS programs and moving towards economy-wide programs rather than sector-specific like RGGI and TCI? So as an specific example, and Henry, maybe we'll start with you, there's a question about if the UK is considering linking beyond the EU, and are there efforts to advance carbon pricing in other jurisdictions as a result of assuming the COP26 presidency? So let's start with you, Henry, and then others can feel free to jump in.
I think my short response there would be that we're certainly interested in doing so, but that's a longer term ambition. At the moment, UK efforts are focused around negotiations and our negotiating position of potentially linking with the EU ETS. But certainly in the context of assuming COP presidency, we are keen to start and to grow international and transnational dialogues with other jurisdictions, and to learn from the quite extraordinary current flourishing of innovation and interest in cap and trade across the globe.
Okay, great, thank you. Does anyone else want to jump in?
I think, this is Jessica, I think, something that's like economy-wide, sector-wide would certainly be a little bit fairer and would level out prices among carbon markets. But yeah, we're definitely not there that yet. I think though, thinking long term, there certainly is going to be some linkage between RGGI and TCI.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else on that question? It's always interesting to facilitate this without being able to connect in person. But if not, I'll move on to the next question here. Maybe have time for one or two more questions. In general, there was lots of questions about how we can integrate negative emission technology, nature-based solutions into these types of programs. So those working on specific carbon pricing programs, I wonder if you could speak a little bit to how the jurisdiction or the sector is looking at nature-based solutions or negative technology or carbon capture and storage. And this is to anyone.
This is Jessica again. It is reforestation is an applicable offset project in the RGGI program. I don't know if that's exactly what you mean by nature-based solution, but that is one way that we can generate credits, or not generate credits, but offset a compliance obligation through an offset project.
Okay, and actually I might just stick with you, Jessica, because there was a specific question about, and I don't know if this has been decided yet, but if Pennsylvania is considering land-based carbon sequestration, so forestry, for some of the investments from the program.
Sure. So we actually, we haven't even really started having investment conversations. We know what the applicable uses would be. And certainly, you know, those reforestation or, you know, tree planting, those types of programs would be eligible under the Air Pollution Control Act and our authority there. So yeah, I would say we certainly are considering it. We're considering everything that's kind of on the table. And you know, that would be true for TCI as well.
Great, thank you. Anyone else want to loop back around to the negative emission and nature-based solutions question?
I think I'd just say that in a UK context, there's a real drive to increase the role of nature-based solutions, afforestation in particular, but also increasingly peatland restoration, which is particularly pertinent in the UK. I think the key driver that we've got here beyond direct funding is there's a very strong and robust and carefully thought through monitoring and evaluation framework, the Woodland Carbon Code, and alongside that now the Peatland Carbon Code, which sets really stringent standards for long-term maintenance, wider environmental and biodiversity implications, and monitoring. And it builds in quite generous buffers to allow for natural variation in amounts of carbon stored and potential for trees to get sick or get chopped down. So it's something that we're looking to drive. But again, this is all in the voluntary offsets market at the current time.
Okay, thank you for that explanation. Anyone else want to chime in?
I would just say it this way, this is Kim. I would just say from that there's been so much, as you mentioned, so much interest in zero carbon or carbon removal technologies. And I think we need to kind of look also at the science of climate change and make sure that we're not over focusing on any one of the kind of three big areas that we need to be developing solutions for. So obviously carbon removals is one of them, but we also need to be doing carbon reduction projects as well as avoided emissions projects. And so we just, I think over focusing on any one area will both lead to supply problems in the market as well as not get us to where we need to go in terms of climate change. And then on the second piece, when it technological removals, I think that's just an area where Engie is diving in pretty deeply at the moment, and especially when it comes to direct air capture technology, and trying to kind of value stack different ways to make these projects pencil out. So it's certainly of great interest to the company that I'm working for now and a lot of the companies that we're advising.
Very helpful, Kim. Yeah, I think that's a great way to frame it. So thank you for setting that up. Okay, well, and Marissa, I don't know if you wanted to add anything on that. Okay. So just we have a few minutes left here, and I do want to give each of you an opportunity to just have about a minute for closing remarks. So I will start with Marissa and kind of go through the panelists in the same order and just ask you to have 1 minute and leave the audience with anything you think are important takeaways or things that they should be following. And while the panelists think about that, again, I just want to thank both our panelists, but also our audience for taking the time to participate in the webinar today. I think this has been a healthy conversation and one that no doubt will continue. So if you have additional questions, feel free to send them our way and we'll be helpful as much as we can. So with that, Marissa, why don't you close us off with your 1 minute closing statement?
Great, thanks, Tom. And I think it's really been an interesting discussion, and thanks also to the other panelists. I guess in closing, I would just say that I think the one message from me that I would like to carry across is that carbon pricing is really only just the theory, and there's a lot of flexibility in the ways in which, and I'm again speaking largely from a policymaker's perspective, but there's a lot of ways in which governments can choose to design that carbon pricing instrument to work in their broader climate change policy mix. So, you know, when talking about it, I would encourage us not to be too path dependent in thinking about certain jurisdictions offering, you know, the only solution in terms of how you can use carbon pricing. And finally, I think one note that we're starting to work a little bit more on at the World Bank is, I mean, not only is there a lot of work that has to be done in terms of figuring out the technical solutions of saying, you know, oh, like how exactly am I going to set my cap? How will I figure out which sectors to cover? But I think it touches upon a bit of what we've discussed today, is that there's very real political economy and political challenges potentially when it comes to carbon pricing, because it does ultimately touch on basic commodity prices. And we do need to be sensitive when we think about ways in which we can talk about why carbon pricing really makes sense to people. I think we've done a really great job of talking to economists and convincing economists about the cost efficiency, but these arguments may not be the most persuasive ones to get everyone on board with carbon pricing.
Thank you very much, Marissa. I think that was well said and increasingly important. And of course, we'll be looping back around for a tutorial on those slides once again. So thank you so much for joining us. Kim, over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, I think the main takeaway for CORSIA is that we've come a long way since we first started conceiving of this global mechanism almost a decade ago. And even though we're still working out the details and we're very frustrated by political setbacks and the setback that COVID represents, you know, it is still a first of its kind mechanism, and it still puts a cap on a global sector. So I would just encourage everyone to kind of stay the course of CORSIA, and to also engage in further ways that we can push decarbonization in the aviation sector, because I do think we're going to need both a market-based measure. I don't see the need for offsetting going away in the foreseeable future for aviation, given the very high cost of in-sector reductions, but I also see the need to push forward with an equal approach with equal focus on actual in-sector reductions. And I look forward to working with potentially some of you on who are listening on the webinar on this going forward.
Thank you so much, Kim, for everything you're doing and for joining the conversation today. Jessica.
Really quick, I'll just say that, you know, from a state regulator perspective, you know, we know that carbon pricing isn't perfect. No policy really is, but it's a pretty good policy. It's a pretty good way at, you know, capping and reducing emissions. So when I say carbon pricing, I'm talking about cap and invest programs, which are I think they're a little different, but you know, we are doing our best to address those imperfections in it. We're trying to design programs that that address the flaws, you know, with regard to environmental justice and low income impacts. So, you know, it's not an easy fix, but it's certainly one. It's a really good tool to have in the toolbox, we'll say, and you know, just encourage other states that are thinking about it to kind of, you know, have that courage and do something big. And you know, we all have a responsibility to address climate change, and it's certainly one way to do it. And we think that it's a pretty fair way to do it, at least from our perspective.
Thank you, Jessica. Very helpful, and thank you for the detailed presentation about what's going on in Pennsylvania as well. And to close us off, Henry.
Tom, thank you, and thank you, everyone. What would I say? I think I'd echo the points that have been made about we really are in the early days here. I mean, my Hotmail account is older than International Cap and Trade. We really are at the beginning of learning how to do this and to do this well. I think particularly in terms of, as has been said, taking this from the realm of theory and learning how to turn it into really robust, impactful policy tools to get the outcomes that we want and need. And I think with this come a whole range of questions about how we make this salient to people, to citizens, and how we integrate this with the other policy levers that we have and need at this point in time. I think driving this forward is currently sort of an exponential increase in innovation, improvisation, and I think increasingly importantly, we're going to need adaptive learning as more and more cap and trade approaches are rolled out across a range of economies and societies and circumstances. I think the importance of effective evaluation, monitoring, and iterative learning is going to be key to make the most of this in the coming years. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Henry. Very well said, and I appreciate you taking the time to join us today. That closes the webinar. Moving forward with carbon pricing, it will be available on the C2ES YouTube page in about 24 hours. You can also continue the conversation by finding us on Twitter at C2ES_org or emailing us at webinar@c2es.org. Thank you so much for your time and participation, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. Goodbye for now.